I think I said everything I probably wanted to say in the last 2 days. So kind of, some of you have heard it, and I'll try to kind of summarize. I've never worked so hard. I have to say, I mean, I would only do it for you, Dr. Farouk. This must be the 5th presentation. So I apologize for those who have heard very great parts of this. What I'll try to do is to sort of summarize some of the things I've been trying to say, and also in a way it kind of reaffirms what Dr. Farouk just said. So I'll try to be kind of succinct, and I have a kind of a quick PowerPoint. It does seem to me that when we're talking about this very large issue of religion and politics, that there are kind of 3 trends that we can note, and they're not necessarily consistent. They could be considered contradictory. The first is that, you know, let's face it, there has been a secularization in the modern world. So however you want to define that, you know, consumerism, materialism, certainly in the West, but you might even argue elsewhere, the diminishing authority of the church, a kind of moral relativism. And one sociologist put this quite strongly by saying, we're living in the age of secular discontents. So clearly secularization has occurred, but at the same time, and its obvious point, is that, you know, what we might call the reassertion or the revival of religion has occurred across the board. So whether you want to call this fundamentalism or you call it revivalism, etc., one scholar referred to this as the revenge of God. And what's striking about this is that it's essentially runs against what was the academic orthodoxy, that is to say, modernization theory. So, you know, in the kind of nice, pithy expression of Daniel Lerner, the future was going to be very clear. It's going to be Mecca or mechanization. In other words, there would be one or the other. You couldn't have development with religion, etc. Well, this also meant that there would be the disintegration of tradition, which was to include religion. But in a way, that kind of reaffirms what Weber had worried about. Weber, you know, the great sociologist, had said that secular society would be haunted by the persistence of religious beliefs, by the ghost of religious belief. So in other words, it wasn't going to go away, and in fact it hasn't. And then the third trend is that the modern state, in a way, understands this. It understands the vitality of it, and it seeks to appropriate it. This is exactly what Dr. Farouk was talking about. So, and this is in ways that perhaps maybe are more striking than has occurred, or that we might have assumed. So there, you know, there are many examples of this, and you know, this has been touched on just now by Dr. Farouk and others. So, you know, what might be referred to as Shariatization, the idea that the Sharia should become part of state law, etc. And you can see all kinds of developments, you know, for example, in Egypt, Morocco, of course, Saudi Arabia, the Taliban, etc. That the other is the whole idea of the Islamic State. So whether it's the Republic of Iran, the Islamic Republic, or ISIS, etc., you have suddenly this great emphasis on a concept which really has no roots. It's a modern development. It's something which probably develops as a result of the abolition of the caliphate in the early 20th century. So it's a kind of the invention of tradition, with the investing in it, the assumption that it is something which is venerable and has existed over time. And many of the points that Dr. Farouk was saying, I just sort of summarize here, that, you know, when you think that there is such a thing as the Islamic State, which you want, you assume that religion and state are one and the same thing. That's, of course, one of the points I want to question. So this Din wa Dawla, which becomes kind of a very clear summation of what's supposed to be Islamic political thought, I want to unpack and to question. But it's assumed that the state becomes the Islamic authority, and that the state is the guarantee of virtue. So hisba, and so we must defer to the state because it guarantees this virtue. But what I'd like to remind us is that there's a cultural contingency to the role of religion in politics. In other words, we have to contextualize it. So it's where whatever role religion plays in a society, it has historical and cultural roots. So just for example, if we're talking about Europe, from the 16th century onward, we know that the shift goes from the church to the developing state. But how did this occur? Well, largely through the advent of Protestantism, which argued that if you separate the two, then you're going to be able to protect religion. If you don't separate the two, you're going to end up with corruption, and you're going to end up with a sort of form of tyranny. And so Weber again noted how ironic this was, that the push for a kind of secularism, the separation of religion from the state, was actually done by a religious sect. It was done by Protestantism. And this distinction that virtue inheres in this world, and that if you argue that you are trying to defend an otherworldly virtue, then it's probably a recipe for tyranny. It's it's not the separation of the church and state, and that just simply solidifies power. And of course, historically, to make it the historical point, this is the reason why, at least in the Weberian argument, this is why capitalism developed, because the emphasis is on this world. Virtue inheres on doing well in this world. So what about Islamic history? A different trajectory, of course. And what I just want to get across there is just a couple of points, and I hope this is clear, that to my mind, the idea that there is a religio-political authority, in other words, religion and politics are one and the same, is what is argued, but was not what occurred in fact. So you could say that the religious institution and the political institution diverged when? Huge debate. Some say the 11th century, some say the 10th century, some say the 9th century. Ibn Khaldun said the 7th century, right after the rightly guided caliphs, right after the Khulafa ar-Rashidun. Then you have this development. In other words, the kind of presumption that they're one and the same really goes out the window very quickly. But, even if there isn't a religio-political unification, it doesn't mean that religion is unimportant politically. And so here you have to look at the role of the religious establishment in a way, or religious authorities, as acts as legitimizers of power. And you can cut, so I'm cutting through now centuries of history just to say this, that if you think of the development of the Islamic empires is the movement from kind of tribal urban society, tribal rural societies to urban societies, then you have something profound that occurred. Urbanization and literacy that went with it. As that occurred, it enforced or encouraged the power of the religious elite. In other words, the ulama. So the religious elite emerged as actors, political actors, and they're able to legitimize. So religion is a political actor. So in my view, there's been a separation in fact in the past between religion and state. And of course, the problem is that many now say that it should be this, but at least historically it wasn't. So the state, in the form of the caliphate, was actually, in my mind, a political institution with religion the supporting act. Religion was the supporter of it, but it wasn't the same. So here, if you can get your head around this paradox, the Islamic experience was really close to the Protestant ideal. So the Protestant ideal was secularizing religion. That's actually what happened in fact, but not what the ideal is in Islam. So we have a kind of a divergence between ideal and reality, but it doesn't mean that it has receded, that religion has receded, and so how is it there? Well, it's societally embedded, and we've got to be reminded of that. It's such an obvious point, but why would anybody politically care about religion? Because society cares about religion, because people care about it, etc. So it's embedded. Secondly, it's institutionalized. We had last night a really interesting paper by Imran about the constitutionalization of Islam and of religion. And so that's one way we could say it's there. It's constitutionally enshrined. But there are also actors that are political actors. So the ulama, the religious bureaucracy. And can I point out that the religious bureaucracy doesn't always overlap with the ulama. So sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So you can think of state bureaucrats being religious bureaucrats who are not necessarily ulama. And then we have political movements or Islamist movements. So religion becomes a political actor. Why? Because it represents and articulates the values of people. So I'm going to come now sort of towards the end here by saying, well, there are problems. But the problem is not religion. The problem is not Islam, etc., because you can interpret religion in any which way you want. So I'm not here trying to make a simple argument, you know, religion's good, politics is bad. Religion can be interpreted in any way you want, etc. What is the problem is when you kind of bind it up with power. So just focusing on the state, when the state presumes to speak on behalf, this is what Dr. Farouk just said, when it presumes to speak on behalf of the divine, when it presumes to speak on behalf of virtue, then you have problems. So here's just a quick outline of what I think are the problems. It assumes that you can impose on society because you know better than society. It blurs the realm between public and private. And we had such an interesting paper about Wahhabism in the course of the conference where, you know, things like how do you pray, etc., what do you wear, you know, what I would call a private matter, become an issue of public morality and therefore can be enforced by essentially religious institutions, the religious police, etc. What's another problem? If you rely on the virtue of the rulers, good luck. If you don't have institutional, structural protections for you, then I think you have perhaps a recipe for tyranny. And then finally, it kind of can reinforce these unjust authorities because you presume to be speaking for God. So I just want to point out that, you know, I've been talking essentially about the state, but you can also talk about Islamist movements, maybe not all of them, but some of them. And, you know, fundamentalism in a broad sense is a kind of reaction to modern relativism. So, you know, it's the assertion that we are not like the others. We're different. We do have virtue. The others don't, etc. We're true to the traditions. The others aren't. So those movements have a kind of a clear impulse behind them. But I'm here invoking another sociologist of religion, Peter Berger, who actually who's warned us. So if I'm warning you about the state, he's warning us about Islamist movements or for any fundamentalist movements. And in any religion, what he says is it can go either in two ways, and either one of them is not good. One is micro-totalitarianism, impose on your own community. So Wahhabis imposing on the Shia, that sort of argument. Or the Reconquista model. You know, this is the reference to Andalusia, to Islamic Spain. You know, the Christians come back and force the Muslims to convert, force the Jews to convert. In other words, like ISIS, in a sense, with the Yazidis, like ISIS with others. In other words, we will reconquer society, and you must become like me. You must become like us. So his argument is, wow, it could be a problem. So I'm kind of ending now. The balance of probabilities, of course, you could argue that, you know, I've overstated the dangers here. So I don't want to leave the impression that all political authorities who use religion are tyrannical. Or that they're inevitably tyrannical. And I don't want to leave the impression that the secular rulers are all great. You know, Stalin, etc. There's so many others that you can do. But the balance of probabilities, at least to my mind, is that if you have a religious state, and even with some of the Islamist movements, it kind of comes down to a simple point. Political elites use religion for political purposes. Simple as that. And I quoted in the course of the conference, and I just give you an example. There's this Ayatollah who questions the role of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who said, you know, they presume that it is the Ad-Dawla al-Islamiyya, the Islamic State. It's actually Ad-Dawla al-Khomeiniya. It's the Khomeini state. In other words, it's a political elite reaffirming its power rather than an Islamic state. So in doing this, what happens is the particularistic interests kind of trump the common good. And there, I think, is a problem. So my final sentence, as the Christian Reformation argued, when the state or the would-be state thinks it is doing God's work, it kind of runs the risk of betraying both the people and God. Thanks.